The meeting was scheduled for 2:30 p.m. on a Thursday in March 1975. Warren Beatty walked into the conference room at Paramount Studios with a young man nobody in the room recognized, mid-20s, nervous, carrying a worn leather bag with script pages sticking out. His name was David, a screenwriter. His first major project. Beatty had been working with him for 8 months on a political thriller, something dark, cynical, about corruption and media manipulation. The script is extraordinary, dangerous in the best way. That's why they were here, to finalize the deal. 3 executives sat across the table, contracts, development budgets, production timelines. Everyone smiled. Everyone was professional. Then one of the executives said, "Warren, we love the Rick. We want to move forward, but we need to make one adjustment." Beatty leaned back. "What kind of adjustment?" "We'd like to bring in a more experienced writer for the rewrite." The room went very quiet. David's face didn't change, but his hands tightened slightly on the armrest of his chair. Beatty looked at the executive. "The script doesn't need a rewrite. It's strong," the executive agreed, "but David's never had a produced credit. We need someone who understands structure, pacing, studio notes. Someone we can rely on to deliver." David delivered. Beatty said, "You're holding the result. We're not questioning his talent." Another executive jumped in. "But this is a $12 million production. We need protection. We'll compensate him fairly for his work. Full credit for story. But the screenplay credit goes to someone with a track record." Beatty stood up. Not aggressively, just calmly. He picked up his jacket from the back of his chair. "Then we're done here." The executives looked confused. "Warren, wait. Let's talk about this." "There's nothing to talk about," Beatty said. "David wrote this script. If he's not writing the film, I'm not making it." He turned to David. "Let's go." David grabbed his bag and followed Beatty out of the room. Behind them, 3 executives sat in stunned silence, trying to figure out what had just happened. If you think this is a story about Hollywood discovering mentorship in the 1970s, you're missing the point. This isn't about being a good person. This isn't about Warren Beatty playing protector to struggling artists. This is about something more structural, understanding that the work only exists because of the people who created it, and refusing to let a system separate the two. Hollywood has always had a problem with writers. They're necessary. Obviously, you can't make a film without a script. But once the script exists, studios start doing math. Can we get this same story cheaper? Can we bring in someone more controllable? Someone who won't push back on notes? Writers, especially young, unproven writers, have almost no leverage. They can be replaced, rewritten, bought out. Actors have leverage. Directors have leverage. Writers, they're expendable. That's the calculation studios made constantly in the 1970s. You'd pay a young writer to develop something promising. Then, once you had the bones of the story, you'd bring in a veteran to polish it. That veteran would get screenplay credit. The original writer would get a story credit and a fraction of the money. It was standard practice, legal, SAG approved. And it destroyed young writers' careers before they started. Because nobody cares about story credit. What matters in Hollywood is screenplay credit. That's what gets you hired for the next project. Warren Beatty understood that system intimately, and he'd decided, early in his career, that when he had leverage, he'd use it to break that pattern. David wasn't the first writer Beatty had worked with, but he was different in one crucial way. He was completely unknown. Other writers Beatty had collaborated with had reputations. Robert Towne, Buck Henry. Even when they faced studio pressure, their names carried weight. David had nothing, no credits, no agent powerful enough to push back, no industry relationships to leverage. If Beatty walked away, David's script would disappear into studio archives. Maybe they'd use pieces of it. Maybe they'd option it to someone else and rewrite it beyond recognition. Either way, David's career would stall before it began. Beatty knew that math, and he decided it wasn't acceptable. The executives called Beatty's agent the next morning. What just happened? The agent, who'd been through enough of these situations to know the pattern, sighed. Warren meant what he said. Over a writer? The executive asked, incredulous. We're not replacing Warren. We're just bringing in someone to tighten the script. He doesn't see it that way. Then help him see it that way. This is a $12 million film. We're not gambling that budget on an untested writer. The agent was quiet for a moment. You're gambling that Warren won't walk. He will. That's insane. He's been developing this for months. I know, he'll lose the project. He doesn't care. There was a pause on the line. What does he want? I think you know what he wants, the agent said. Another pause. Longer. We can't set that precedent. If we let an actor dictate writer approval, every negotiation becomes impossible. Then you don't have Warren Beatty. The executive hung up. Here's what happened over the next 3 months. Nothing. The project sat in development limbo. Paramount had the script, but they didn't have Beatty, and without Beatty, they couldn't get financing at the level they needed. They tried shopping the project to other actors. Nobody bit. Either they weren't interested, or they heard why Beatty had walked and didn't want to cross him. Meanwhile, Beatty and David kept working. They refined the script. They shopped it quietly to other studios. They made it clear this was a package deal. You got both of them, or neither. In June, a smaller studio made an offer. Less money, tighter budget, but David's name stayed on the screenplay. Full credit, full protection in the contract. No rewrites without his approval. Beatty signed, David signed. Paramount's executives read about it in Variety. The film shot that fall. It was tough. Lower budget meant less margin for error. But Beatty and David worked together through every challenge. When studio notes came in, David was in the room to defend his script. Not because he was being pressured, but because Beatty had made sure he had the contractual protection to be there. The film released the following year. It wasn't a massive blockbuster, but it was critically respected. It made money, and David's script was singled out for praise. More importantly, David got hired for his next project. Then the one after that. By the early 1980s, he was an established screenwriter with a real career. None of that happens if Warren Beatty walks into that meeting alone. Here's the part Hollywood didn't want to admit. The studio had been wrong. David's script didn't need an experienced rewriter. It needed to be filmed as written. The studio's objection wasn't based on the quality of the work. It was based on risk management, on precedent, on the assumption that unknown writers are liabilities. Beatty had seen through that immediately. He'd read enough scripts, worked with enough writers, to know when something worked. David's script worked. Everything else was fear disguised as prudence. The message Beatty sent that day traveled quietly through Hollywood. It wasn't public. There was no interview where he explained what happened. No statement about protecting writers. But people in the industry heard the story. A major star had walked away from a project he'd developed for months. Not because of money, not because of creative differences with the director, but because the studio wanted to replace a writer. That was new. Actors walked over billing, over salary, over final cut. They didn't walk over screenwriters. Beatty did, and that forced a recalculation. If a star of Beatty's caliber was willing to use his leverage to protect a writer, then writers weren't as replaceable as studios had assumed. Not all of them, not always. Sometimes the writer was the point, and separating the script from the writer destroyed the thing you were trying to make. Here's what that moment changed, slowly. More actors started paying attention to who wrote their projects. Not just whether the script was good, but whether the writer who created it was being treated fairly. Some actors started inserting writer protections into their contracts. Approval clauses, requirements that original writers stay involved through production. Not everywhere, not consistently, but enough that studios had to adjust. The old pattern, buy out the young writer, bring in the veteran, became riskier, because sometimes the star would walk. And suddenly that risk management strategy was causing the exact risk it was supposed to prevent. Warren Beatty never gave David public credit for what happened. That was intentional. The moment you make it about loyalty or gratitude, it becomes a favor, a one-time act of kindness. Beatty didn't want it to be a favor. He wanted it to be a principle. Writers create the work, and removing them from the work destroys the thing you're trying to make. That's not sentiment. That's pragmatism. If you believe in the script, you have to believe in the person who wrote it. And if the studio doesn't understand that, you find a different studio. Years later, someone asked David what Beatty said when they walked out of that meeting at Paramount. David remembered it clearly. They'd gotten into Beatty's car, sat in silence for a minute. Then Beatty said, "They'll call back. They always do. And when they don't, we'll find someone who gets it." No drama, no anger, just certainty. David asked, "Why are you doing this?" Beatty looked at him. "Because if I don't, nobody else will, and then you wrote that script for nothing." That was the whole conversation. Warren Beatty wasn't feared because he protected people. He was feared because he made protection non-negotiable. The studio thought they were negotiating a standard deal: replace the writer, keep the star, make the movie. Beatty showed them those weren't separate issues. You got the writer, or you didn't get it. Once you make those two things inseparable, the studio loses the ability to divide and conquer. That's the leverage shift the system couldn't process. If actors could tie their involvement to the treatment of writers, then writers suddenly had power they'd never had before. Borrowed power, but power nonetheless. And in an industry where power is everything, even borrowed power changes the game. Real power isn't protecting yourself. It's making someone else's protection a condition of your participation. Think about the last time someone you worked with got pushed out unfairly. Did you stay silent, or did you make it clear that pushing them out meant losing you too? If this story resonated, subscribe. More stories about protection, principle, and the moments when leverage actually meant something.